It started with 10,000 bubbles erupting from my pool, but this wasn't some backyard fantasy. My HOA dictator neighbor had just declared chemical warfare on my property, and security cameras caught her red-handed. What she didn't know: this was the final straw in our year-long feud. By sunrise, her precious lawn would become ground zero for the most satisfying suburban revenge plot ever filmed. What happened next? Well, let's just say karma's a soapy bitch. You're probably thinking, why would she target my pool in the first place? Let me show you the 8 months of petty tyranny that led to this moment. The earliest warning sign was a simple note pinned to my front door. Back then, I didn't know that each piece of paper she left, each subtle complaint about my mailbox, lawn color, and mildly eccentric gardening style, was building toward the day she would try turning my entire backyard into a giant bubble bath. But that note was the beginning. It read something like, "Your flower bed does not meet our community standards." I remember laughing about it, shrugging it off and tossing it in the trash. Little did I know, I'd just sparked the wrath of an HOA queen who believed she had absolute authority over every inch of our neighborhood. Fast forward 6 months, and we were well past polite post-it note requests. By then, she had threatened me with fines for letting my hedges grow 2 inches taller than her personal preference. She circulated flyers reminding everyone to keep their trash bins out of sight by precisely 8 a.m., referencing me by address in a humiliating spotlight. In all that time, I tried to stay calm. I tried to be civil, but the real kicker landed the day she slipped an official-looking violation notice into my mailbox, demanding that I replace my entire fence because its wood grain didn't match the standard style. I wasn't even in her HOA. My property was grandfathered outside its jurisdiction, but she acted like that detail was nothing more than a technicality. Eventually, I installed a security camera, figuring it would at least capture her next stunt for documentation, and sure enough, it did more than that. It caught her in the act of pouring an industrial-sized box of detergent straight into my pool one crisp morning, creating a churning mess of foam. My hands shook with 6 months of pent-up rage as I replayed the footage. This bleach-blonde tyrant had turned my sanctuary into a bubble bath, and I was about to return the favor tenfold. I called my best friend Matt, who was all too familiar with the Karen Chronicles. He had witnessed the mailbox fines, the snide remarks at block parties, and the forced grin I wore every time she marched over to deliver her latest sermon on proper community living. The second Matt saw the footage, he blurted, "We have to get her back." I didn't know how far we'd take it, but I knew I couldn't let her keep walking over. The opportunity arrived that very afternoon at the local HOA meeting, which Karen chaired like a medieval monarch addressing her subjects. Even though I wasn't a member, I decided to attend, armed with the security clip of her detergent dump. The room was packed, rows of neighbors trapped between fear of Karen's wrath and a growing fatigue with her micromanagement. She stood at the front, posture stiff, hair unmoving beneath the hum of the ceiling fan, lecturing everyone about repainting shutters in the authorized shade of beige. Karen's community standards speech dissolved into shouts of rebellion as I played the damning footage. Neighbors who'd endured her $200 mailbox fines now smelled blood in the water. I expected a reaction from her, maybe shock or a desperate attempt to justify herself, but she barely blinked. Instead, she called my pool an eyesore and claimed she was helping to maintain neighborhood cleanliness. It was textbook Karen: deflect, deny, then double down on the moral high ground. The tension in the room like we'd reached a tipping point. But before I could push harder, she dismissed the entire incident and haughtily moved on to the next agenda item. On the drive home, I seethed at how easily she brushed off her wrongdoing. Matt leaned over and said, "If you really want to get rid of that soap in your pool, you could drain it. Let me guess, right onto her perfect lawn?" He gave me the kind of grin that told me he was only half joking. That was the moment I realized the line between petty revenge and something far bigger had just blurred. I went to bed that night still wrestling with the ethics of sabotage, but by morning, I was done playing nice. I had 43 minutes before Karen's morning sprinklers would spread the soapy payload, Matt told me, double-checking local sunrise times on his phone. We hauled out a sturdy hose and connected it to the pool's drain, aiming the outflow across the fence. Was it juvenile? Probably. Was it exactly what she deserved? Absolutely. Before draining, know it yet, but Matt's go-bigger idea would uncover Karen's dirtiest secret, one that would make her wish she'd stuck to writing parking tickets. I figured the most I'd do was flood her yard with sudsy water, give her a taste of her own medicine, and capture that perfect moment of shock on her face when she realized the scale of her mess. But destiny or karma really had bigger plans. The process took hours. The night air was cool, and the entire street was asleep, which eased my fear of getting caught mid-act. Now and then, the hose sputtered as pockets of air escaped, but the flow stayed steady, carrying all that foam, chlorine, and residue from my pool straight into Karen's meticulously groomed paradise. By the time I closed the valve, the job was done. I stood there in the darkness, feeling almost giddy. The water had to go somewhere after all, and if I left it in my pool, I'd be stuck skimming bubbles for days. Why not share the joy with my favorite HOA tyrant? Dawn revealed her pounding in foamy sludge, the acrid stench of detergent clinging to her McMansion's vinyl siding. That first glimpse was priceless. I watched from my window as Karen stumbled out of her front door, clearly expecting her usual morning serenity. Instead, she was greeted by a small ocean of white foam creeping across her lawn and onto the sidewalk. Her scream pierced the neighborhood, but her meltdown was just Act 1. What happened when city inspectors arrived? That's where this story gets legally delicious. She glared down at the suds in disbelief, probably unsure how to handle a catastrophe of her own making. Within minutes, a couple of neighborhood kids discovered the foam and began leaping around in it, laughing like they'd discovered a magical backyard wonderland. Karen shrieked at them to get off her property, but they just cackled and kicked more froth around. That's when she saw me, standing on my front porch. Her eyes narrowed into seething slits, and she stomped across the street, nearly slipping on the slick pavement. "This is your fault," she shouted, voice cracking as she pointed an accusatory finger at my chest. "You drained your disgusting pool onto my property." She gestured frantically at the mess, as if I could somehow remove it all with a snap of my fingers. I feigned wide-eyed innocence, telling her that gravity worked in mysterious ways, and maybe she should have considered that before pouring a mountain of detergent into my backyard. Her tirade escalated quickly. She threatened to call the city, the HOA, the police, maybe even the FBI for all I knew. As far as she was concerned, I was guilty of destruction of property on a felony level. Meanwhile, Matt ambled over, hands in his pockets, barely suppressing a grin. He mumbled something about how soap wasn't exactly toxic waste, and that maybe Karen should relax. This only fueled her outrage. Sure enough, an inspector showed up not long after, responding to what had surely been Karen's frantic phone calls. He was a middle-aged guy who looked like he'd seen enough suburban turf wars to fill a novel, while Karen unleashed a hysterical account of how I had sabotaged her yard with chemical-laden water. The inspector stood there with a notepad, blinking like he just wanted a coffee break. Finally, he turned to me and asked if I had drained my pool. I admitted I had, though I added that I never specifically aimed it at Karen's lawn. If the water followed the slope of the ground, that wasn't my fault. Karen shrieked, demanding my immediate arrest. The inspector gave her this long, dispassionate look and calmly explained that draining pool water into the street or a nearby property wasn't generally a crime. "At worst, this might be a civil matter," he said, and Karen's face nearly turned purple. I could see that none of this was going her way, which almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. But then Matt, who had been flipping through something on his phone, let out a triumphant laugh. "I've got it," he said. "Jake, you've got to see this." He turned the screen toward me, and my jaw dropped. Turns out Karen's perfect lawn was fed by stolen city water. 6 years' worth of $12,000 secret bills, from what Matt was piecing together in real time. He'd discovered property records and water usage discrepancies that spelled out a hidden pipeline rerouted from a city water main. The second Karen saw the triumphant look on my face, she went pale. When I handed the phone to the inspector, she started sputtering excuses. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "They're forging documents, it's an internet hoax. You people will do anything to frame me." But the inspector recognized official city logs when he saw them. He immediately called for backup from the water department, which arrived on the scene shortly thereafter, dragging along equipment to test and confirm the secret piping. Meanwhile, neighbors gathered around, some in slippers or pajamas, gawking at Karen's meltdown and the foam carpeting half the street. Mr. Thompson, who had been fined for having a mailbox that was allegedly an inch too tall, was especially gleeful. "Looks like your perfect community wasn't so perfect after all," he quipped, as water department officials started digging around. When they found the unauthorized connection under her rose beds, the entire neighborhood erupted into scandalized chatter. This was more than a small code violation. It was a blatant theft that spanned years. Karen tried every excuse in the book, blaming her late husband, the previous owners, her landscapers. Each claim crumbled under the weight of the documented evidence. The water department official, looking both exasperated and grimly satisfied, explained she'd be facing substantial fines, plus back charges on every gallon siphoned from the city. Karen's usual bravado flickered, replaced by outright panic. I stepped back to watch the show on. Word traveled fast, and soon even the most loyal HOA supporters were whispering that Karen should step down. Their so-called queen was suddenly dethroned, pinned under the gravity of real legal consequences. Someone suggested a special vote to remove her from power entirely. Karen shrieked that they had no right. One of the board members calmly reminded her that official recall procedures were perfectly valid, especially in cases of misconduct. Karen, red-faced and humiliated, looked around for any last ally in the crowd, but found only grim satisfaction among neighbors she'd terrorized for years. As the water department wrapped up their investigation, the inspector issued a formal report noting illegal siphoning, the comedic bubble fiasco, and the growing list of neighbors complaining about Karen's questionable leadership. It was the perfect storm. With the entire community turning on her, she didn't stand a chance. She might have gotten away with the water theft if she hadn't declared war on my pool, if she'd just quietly enjoyed her artificially lush grass. But now that everyone knew, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. When the day ended, Karen found herself slapped with immediate fines, facing possible charges, and ousted from the very HOA she'd dominated. Officials left her property in shambles, foam still stuck to the corners of her yard, and wet footprints marking where inspectors had trudged around all morning. Her once flawless lawn, the envy of every misguided neighbor who believed Karen's boasts about her green thumb, was now limp, muddy, and reeking of detergent. I watched from my porch as the sun began to dip. Matt stood beside me, arms crossed, looking proud of his discovery. "You realize," he said, "that if she hadn't messed with your pool, we never would have looked this deep into her records." I nodded, thinking about how close she'd come to continuing her little water theft scheme indefinitely. In a strange twist, her own desire to ruin my sanctuary had been her undoing. That evening, people came out of their houses more than usual, exchanging gossip at the end of driveways, or snapping pictures of the last of the foam. It felt like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled after months, years really, of tension. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Maybe she was hiding inside her house, furiously Googling how to reverse water theft charges. The next day, I heard a rumor from Mr. Thompson that the city had started calculating the total back pay Karen owed, plus potential fines for every year the siphoning occurred. It was going to be a massive bill. She'd also received separate fines from the newly invigorated HOA board for negligence and code violations. Word had spread that the city's attorneys were considering pressing charges. In short, her empire was toast. Meanwhile, I was already busy repairing my pool, properly this time, without any leftover soap residue. Matt helped me skim off the last of the bubbles. Between passes of the skimmer, we'd glance at Karen's house, half expecting an enraged face to appear at the window. But it never did. Her reign was over. The best part was that it hadn't cost me much more than a hose and a little nerve. Sometimes I think back on the moment she marched up to me, jabbing her finger in my face, so confident she could bully me into submission once again. It's strange how quickly the tables can turn when you shine a light on what's really hiding under a bully's facade. Hers was a fragile tower built on stolen resources, and once we pulled out a single brick, the entire structure collapsed. Matt, ever the instigator, joked about organizing a foam party to celebrate her downfall, but we ultimately decided against rubbing it in too hard. Besides, Karen was suffering enough. The new HOA board scheduled an immediate meeting, and it became official. She was permanently removed from any position of authority. Before the vote, she tried to launch one last desperate speech, claiming everything was a misunderstanding, but the crowd didn't buy it. They'd seen actual proof of her siphoning. They'd watched her meltdown. She had no power left, and she knew it. I won't lie, I experienced a wave of satisfaction when the neighbors voted her out, one by one, raising their hands as she stood there trembling. This was the same woman who had once lectured me on my incorrectly painted fence panels and threatened people with constant fines. Now she had no platform, no credibility, and potentially no savings once she paid the city back. Matt teased me about feeling a twinge of guilt, but I shook my head. After what she did to my pool, and to all the other homeowners she'd harassed, I felt the punishment fit the crime. In the days that followed, Karen's meltdown became a local legend. The best snippet on social media was her reaction to the foam tsunami at dawn. Someone captured her screaming on video, standing in pajamas as soap crept onto her driveway. All that scolding about community standards undone by one massive, unstoppable bubble wave. For me, it was an exclamation point on a year of her tyranny. For everyone else, it was a sweet taste of schadenfreude. When I finally finished cleaning the last of the residue from my pool's edges, I leaned on my skimmer handle, staring at the clear water. It felt like a symbol of relief. No more passive-aggressive notes. No more imaginary fines. No more waking up to find that she'd reorganized my trash bins to fit her aesthetic. The entire neighborhood seemed happier. People were chatting, inviting one another over, planning small gatherings that Karen would never preside over again. We'd gotten our community back by removing the toxic element that had once ruled it. A week later, I ran into Mr. Thompson at the hardware store, and he told me Karen had tried to sell her house in a desperate bid to pay. The problem was, word about the siphoning scandal had spread fast, and no one was eager to move onto a property flagged for water theft. She was, for the first time in her life, out of luck and out of options. Some folks might pity her, but I remembered her self-righteous smirk every time she threatened to fine another neighbor. She earned the fallout one soapy bubble at a time. Those initial bubbles? They cost Karen $8,300 in fines, her HOA thrown, and every shred of dignity. Next time you see an overzealous neighborhood tyrant, remember, even queens get checkmated.